Hello and welcome to Talking Events, the industry podcast brought to you by Event Industry News. Today being recorded from the HQ of Blackout in South London. Blackout, suppliers of drapes and rigging to the international live events industry. A very big thank you to the team at Blackout for allowing us to set up the Talking Events studio and record these latest episodes from their HQ. Today we're going to be talking about the live event rigger apprenticeship and the Trailblazer initiative that was instigated by the government. And giving us a little bit more insight on this subject is today's panel of guests. So we welcome back to the studio Eric Porter, freelance event rigger and trainer within the industry. Eric,
hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Adelaide Johannsen, HR manager for Blackout. Adelaide, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
And Paul Riddiford, NRC manager from Plasa, here to add a little bit of perspective and perhaps throw some of his own questions out there. Paul, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
The live event rigger apprenticeship. How did it come about, first of all, and what is it going to bring to the industry? Adelaide, who wants to pick up this one and roll with it?
Well, it's unfortunate that Paul Rowlands of the National Arenas Association, and particularly the NEC group, is not able to join us today. He was initially the driving force in putting a national event rigger apprenticeship into this Trailblazer umbrella, and he's devoted a lot of time and effort and provided resources for our trial runs of it. Given that the NRC already exists, and he's a big supporter and historically always has been,
Which is the National
Rigging Certificate.
Yep.
The Trailblazer architecture requires much more in terms of the development of an individual. It's working along the lines of somebody young with potentially zero experience or knowledge of the field that they're going into and turning them out at the end of the period into somebody who could be left very much in charge of things.
So this is an apprenticeship that would afford any person the opportunity to step into this area and into this arena and learn from the ground up. Would that be fair to say, Adelaide?
Absolutely. The ideology is that it would be 18-year-olds and above. And we've had interest from people who are into their 20s and 30s who are keen to get into the industry and that of rigging, and therefore there is no holds barred really on who will be able to join in.
How was it first instigated? Because we have heard an awful lot about the government wanting to promote apprenticeships and work-based learning and promote industries actually developing their own apprenticeship schemes. So how did this particular one come about?
We from the National Rigging Advisory Group, Paul Rowlands basically said, this is what I think would be a great thing to do, a great initiative, who's in it with us. And we formed a working committee, and we got at least 10 to 12 employers who were able to back it when the first standard went in. So we all joined forces, wrote a standard that was then sent to the government, so the Business Innovation and Skills Department, BIS, and that was passed back in May 2015.
So that's the first stage, if you will. You first of all have to submit what sounds like an application to actually be accepted to then develop your apprenticeship scheme. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And you need to have a number of employers who are willing to back it. And so we got a lot of support throughout the industry, as well as sole companies as well.
I'm just looking at some information that we've been given from CC Skills, I think, or a link that I've been sent, and the quote simply says, at the moment there seems to be a sufficient number of riggers in the marketplace to service the needs of the entertainment industry. However, it follows that as one person leaves and as people leave the industry or retire from the industry, there has to be a clear pathway for people to then progress up and fill those spaces. Was that something that was looked upon as
I think
something that was on people's minds when you thought, hold on, yes, there is a need to do this long term, or is there a short term benefit that this will bring as well?
I think it's very much a long term observation. The key was very much the demographics of the NRC level 2 and level 3 riggers that we've got at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's probably now's a good time. From the information that we have from Plasa, the average level 2 rigger or competent NRC level rigger is something along the lines of 34, 36.
Okay.
Which in itself is quite old now, but we are obviously aware, with the information again from our records, is that riggers, the experienced riggers who were first around when the industry developed back in the day, are getting to the point now where they're starting to leave the industry. Mm-hmm. And it is so important that as people leave at the back end, that we're bringing people in at the front. I think it's important to state actually that before the Trailblazer, a lot of rigging companies and employers were already running their own in-house apprenticeships. Yeah. And this was seen as a great opportunity to make this a national qualification by entering into the Trailblazer scheme.
Is that fair to say? Was that something that Blackout were doing? Presumably, as the level that you're operating at, Adelaide, that there is a level of CPD and in-house training that goes on anyway.
Absolutely. Everybody who joins to become a rigger would go through the various different courses and gain the certification within health and safety, working at height, mm-hmm. etc. I think as employers together, we felt that using all the resources that we had, we could develop a thorough training programme which would allow somebody to develop beyond the National Rigging Certificate Level 2.
And more importantly, a programme that's a nationally recognised programme as well.
Yeah.
When it came to actually to funding this, would I be right in saying that the whole Trailblazer initiative that the government was promoting actually offered funding to help create these apprenticeships, which is again offering a good incentive to this industry in this example to actually go out there and do it? Is that right?
I'm not sure about there was money available for the creation, but the initiative, the Trailblazer initiative, how it differs from standard apprenticeships or old apprenticeships is that the government are very keen that these are employer driven. So right. the emphasis is on the employer to say what they require for industry. So it was offered out that if employers could come to the table with an offer, it would be discussed. For my information, I don't know that there was funding available for the development, right. But certainly the government are making available funding for employers once the apprenticeship starts. So there is there's this carrot that's being dangled so that there is money, the pots of money available for employers to claim back.
So basically the cost of the training of an apprentice throughout their period of training could be £9,000, for mm-hmm. example, and the government has pledged through the rigging one to give 2/3 of that money through a grant scheme, so that an employer is only having to pay for 1/3, but all the training, the NRC assessment, the working at height, the health and safety, all those aspects are covered within the scheme. It's a 2/3 basis that the government will invest.
And when we talk about timescales, apprenticeships of this nature have to happen, understandably, over a prolonged period of time. What is the timescale involved for somebody who would start from day one?
It is how long is a piece of string, again, because certain individuals might develop at a speedier rate, and it's not a one-size-fits-all, because each employer has the right to choose how quickly and what elements that their apprentice will undertake. However, as a rule of thumb, we envisage an apprentice fresh from school or college, mm-hmm. starting and being able to be NRC qualified within 2 years, 30 months.
And so you mentioned this is being driven by employers and being driven as a workplace learning. Would that be the right phrase to use?
It's to a certain degree. The programme, it's very difficult, but as best practice and as the people that have developed the programme, our aim has been to allow any employer to choose to undertake it.
Right.
They have to therefore follow the endpoint assessment, which is observation beyond the NRC level 2, and providing a portfolio of evidence and attending a Viva type interview. However, the programme that we believe would be best practice involves 3 weeks of residential training, which we have joined forces with Solihull College to develop. And that covers all the generic behaviours, team building, communication, health and safety type training, so that 1 week a year an apprentice would be in that residential programme.
Are we the first country to develop an apprenticeship or any formal government recognised qualification covering this as a subject matter?
From the amount of interest that we've received worldwide, I
would say yes.
I would say yes.
I would hazard a guess as to yes.
Okay. I know it's a bit of an awkward question because it's, without really delving in and doing a lot of research worldwide, but again, we've touched on it in previous episodes, not just in this related subject matter, but in other episodes of Talking Events as to how the UK really does pioneer a lot of stuff within its own event industry. And I'm just curious to know whether or not, again, this is something that we can proudly sort of chalk on the board and say, yeah, we were the first to really look at doing that.
We've received communications from riggers in the States saying, wow, really interested in the programme. People as far afield as Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, India, saying really interested in the apprenticeship programme. So, yes, to answer your question, I believe that we're groundbreaking to a certain degree.
The fact that it's government recognised within the UK or within England, does that make it difficult to translate? And presumably you can't offer it directly to international clients, but does the hard work that's been put into by the collective group that's put the programme together allow that assessment criteria to then be translated overseas? Would any of it translate? I don't know, Eric, perhaps you've worked you must have worked overseas an awful lot. Would any of it translate into other territories?
Yeah, your first question, I think historically there were some initiatives in the United States, particularly around theatre apprenticeships. Within wider event rigging, I'm not sure. This is a UK government scheme, so the operation of the scheme may be restricted to the UK. It seems likely. The architecture, the homework that's already been done is doubtless of value. In fact, I'm a perfect example of somebody for whom the scheme is irrelevant because I'm a freelance individual. I'm not bringing on employees who would fit into an apprenticeship scheme.
Yeah.
But I was got on board because of previous work with the NRC and my membership of the NRAG, National Rigging Advisory Group. So I think it's, as we were discussing in earlier meetings, that the broadening of the NRAG has allowed this kind of thing to emerge, and it will have a relevance particularly to television operations, larger theatrical stuff, which has overlapped with big event rigging. The world, it's evolved a great deal.
Sure.
And this is a much broader project than just the National Rigging Certificate. The National Rigging Certificate is a necessary requirement at as Adelaide said, approximately 2/3 of the way through the process.
Yeah.
There's no point in reinventing a new qualification for rigging if we've had this one in existence for a while.
Yeah.
So I don't know of its future potential beyond the UK borders.
Absolutely. And really, what we need to do first of all, this is a new entity. We need to presumably there hasn't been anybody yet qualified because of the timescale involved potentially. When do we expect to see the first people qualifying as a result of the apprenticeship? Is there any sort of timescale on that? Or?
We're recruiting at the moment, so
Okay.
there's a venture of I'm recruiting. We're selecting, so we've had a lot of applicants, and we hope to go live in October with our first residential. So that involves companies such as UK Rigging, Blackout, the NEC Group, and further people who might listen to this podcast and say, yes, we're up for it.
And we should point out then that if people are listening to this and they want to get involved, there is that opportunity, isn't there,
Absolutely.
for more people to come on board?
Absolutely. So our aim is to do a first residential in Birmingham in the beginning of October, and then it's probably 30 months beyond that the NRC level 2 will be achieved, and then a further 6 months. We liken the NRC level 2 to a driving licence, and therefore any experience having achieved your driving licence or having achieved the NRC level 2 will be the added kudos and experience that would allow a live event rigger to pass the apprenticeship.
Presumably, let's think very carefully how I phrase this, because it's an apprenticeship. Unlike somebody who just wants to get a certificate in something and merely has to pay the fee, demonstrate the competencies in order to meet all the criteria and get their NRC or their NELC, an apprenticeship they have to apply in a similar way to applying for a job. You'll interview them and you'll see whether or not they're appropriate to come onto the apprentice scheme, which it won't be as broad an uptake, will it, as people who are simply applying to do a certificate or a qualification, will it?
There's a lot of interest, and as I said, it's all age ranges, but it's the first foray of getting into the industry and becoming a rigger with a formal programme. And I think that's what has allowed a lot of interest from many individuals, that actually there is a formal programme that allows a person to come with little or no experience of the events industry and actually end up earning a nice salary as a rigger. But they have to be backed by an employer, and that's the whole thing. So it is the same as going for a job interview.
Absolutely. So, but there is now that long-term incentive for them to do it, and presumably by doing it through an employer. I think it was Richard Branson that once said, give people the skills to move on in life, but treat them so that they don't want to. Is there this hope among employers collectively within the industry, having spoken to them, that there will be that sort of loyalty element that develops from people who have come through the apprenticeship programme and who then subsequently want to stick with those employers?
I think the ideology would, we grow our own people and keep hold of them. However, I think there's also the perspective that actually if we're growing people that have been through a programme that has got a lot of kudos to it, it just adds to the industry's standards that, you know somebody that's got the apprenticeship is going to be of a good quality.
Because the flip side of that, and Eric, perhaps we'll bring you on here, a lot of riggers will work freelance. You mentioned yourself a freelance, so you won't necessarily work for specific companies. That maybe changes the loyalty question a little bit, but similarly it's still going to be raising those standards across the board, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. And for individuals who wish to remain freelancers, then that's what the National Rigging Certificate exists at level 2 and level 3. That's what it exists for. But this is a larger scheme, and it's worth mentioning because there'll be a lot of other folk in different live event disciplines listening to this podcast.
Sure.
that there is parallel to this a scheme under Trailblazer for live event technician, and within that you can specialise. I'm not expert on the subject.
Of course,
I've been busy enough advising this one.
Yeah.
But I know that that's been going along in parallel, and there are opportunities for specialisation, obviously in the different disciplines, whether it's LX, audio, scenic, video, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So in terms of the scheme overall, take up should be quite large, especially as you know the industry has been grouping more and more into large industry players.
Absolutely. Is there any obligation on the apprentices themselves to stay with the people that they've done their apprenticeship with once they pass it or once they qualify?
It depends on the contract of employment that they have with that employer, I would imagine, at the end of the day.
Presumably an employer, I'm guessing, wouldn't want to see somebody go through 3 years of an apprenticeship to make them a great employee and then say, oh great, now that I've got my qualification, I'm off to be a freelancer.
There is a certain amount of expectation that people will fly the nest, but
Okay.
if they're adding to the bunch of freelancers and they've worked with you and then you need an extra freelancer, who are you going to go to? The person that you've trained up from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to have that. We can't hold on to every
be
single
realistic
employee.
about what's going to happen and the way the industry works.
Yeah.
But ultimately, as you said, it's still going to improve the standards as a whole. So when they come back to you as a freelancer, you know that there's somebody you want to work with.
But similarly, it's down to each individual employee. They might not want to keep an apprentice employed. They might want to bring in fresh blood each time. So as much as it would be lovely and glowing to keep an employee for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, it's not always realistic to expect that.
As an employer, is there anything that employers have to do to adjust their own working practices, or is there anything that you would have to do at Blackout in order to meet criteria to become an employer that can deliver that apprentice scheme? Is there assessment that you have to undergo yourselves?
There is an expectation that the employer will mentor the apprentice.
Okay.
And I don't know if somebody wants to talk about mentoring.
Have you had any experience of that, Eric?
No, well,
mentoring?
not yet, but it's perfectly possible. I think again, it's more within a company structure that an apprentice could find a mentor, but it would not necessarily have to be. It could be an acquaintance who's freelance and experienced and understands what's required of the scheme. I don't believe that the mentor is required to be from the same company, though I would imagine it would make more sense.
It's not
just
specified.
in terms of management of the scheme. But I don't think it's restricted in that way.
The thing that we prefer with the mentor is that the mentor is not the manager.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I think that's the stipulation that we've suggested in terms of best practice. So, I mean, basically the way that it would work is the apprentice would come on board. They'd attend a week's residential, or at least partake in the college induction as well as an employer induction, and within that undertake the health and safety qualification that's required to become a trainee rigger. They then sign up with Plasa for the trainee rigger scheme, and then it's on-the-job training and practical training, as well as some courses that are necessary to become a rigger, but that's at the employer's discretion, and they can choose which providers they would prefer to use.
Well, I'll throw what may seem like a daft question at you then, because I'm actually looking at gov.uk at their official page for Apprentice Live Event Rigger, and it gives you all the details, the approximate duration of the apprenticeship, the working week, which I think they may be in for a shock for, because it's listed as 37.5 hours. But duties include driving company vehicles. What if you get an apprentice who comes on who hasn't got a driving licence? again, is this what we're talking about here? We said maybe at the discretion of the employer, they may choose to partly fund. Is that a necessary criteria of the scheme?
The driving side of things was a preferred thing for many employers, but some employers, if you're a rigger at the arenas, for example, there's not really the necessity to have a driving licence, and therefore it is down to the individual employer who has their job specification that these are the things that are musts, and these are the things that we would like to have.
Is this one of the benefits of an apprentice scheme as a whole, is that there is this format which has been agreed collectively amongst a lot of different entities, but by being employer driven, it does still offer that level of flexibility where an employer can choose to maybe add bits on and offer other incentives or bits of training if they feel necessary?
Yeah, I believe so. I think that the format of the official or the programme of the apprenticeship exists. And as you say, if an employer wants to add on specific pieces, then that's down to them. The fact that there is funding available gives them that option. But each employer is going to want different things from their apprentices.
The page that I'm looking at for people listening to the podcast is headlined as the Skills Funding Agency, but it's gov.uk, and you can search for apprentice live event rigger. If people want to sort of maybe put into a bit of context what we've been speaking about today, that there is a lot of information on there. Perhaps Adelaide, you could give us a bit more direction on that. If people are listening to this and want to find out more about the apprentice scheme, where would they find it? How can they get their hands on some information?
There's various employers who have committed to recruiting, and therefore there's various job adverts that are on that apprenticeship government website. So that's one way. Contacting any one of the interested parties, so whether it's Blackout or the NEC group or UK Rigging directly is another way. For example, emailing jobs@blackout.co.uk, I've been sending out syllabus to interested parties, so it just gives further information and greater detail of what the course entails.
The fact that we're even talking about being able to send out a syllabus for this as a subject matter and as this as a skill set is a positive all round. I think we would all agree that there is now this qualification for people to actually look at and look at seriously, whereas, you know, I may be wide of the mark, but 25, 30 years ago, if you'd have said there's going to be an apprenticeship in live event rigging, people would have looked at you and thought, go and get a real job. Eric's nodding his head in testament to that. Guys, I think we'll probably tweet some links out from the Talking Events Twitter handle and also the Event Industry News Twitter handle for people to find out a bit more about this, because I think it will have a positive impact as a whole, without a doubt, on the wider industry, and it's important that there's plenty of information shared there. There's been a huge effort collectively amongst a number of different companies, organisations and venues to actually lay down any differences and actually sit round a table in order to develop this. So I think it's important that collectively as an industry we get behind this and everyone shares as much information as possible. We should very much thank our guests on today's episode for talking about this particular subject. Eric Porter, thank you very much for joining Talking Events once again.
Thank you.
Adelaide Johannsen, HR Manager for Blackout, thank you very much for joining us, and indeed for the company's hospitality in hosting the studio for these episodes. Paul Riddiford, NRC Manager from Plasa. Paul, thanks very much for joining us again. Follow the podcast on iTunes. You can subscribe to it via that medium. You can also watch videos of the podcast via eventindustrynews.co.uk. Thank you very much for listening to today's episode. This is Talking Events. My name's James Dixon.